There comes a point when your own life begins to feel strangely unfamiliar. The things you once wanted no longer pull you in the same way. Certain relationships feel different, old fears become easier to see through, and moments you would have dismissed as coincidence start carrying an uncomfortable sense of meaning. You may not know exactly what's changing. You only know that some part of you has begun noticing what it can no longer unsee. And perhaps the strangest part is this. It doesn't feel like you're becoming someone new. It feels as though something older is trying to return. But what if that feeling has less to do with finding yourself than with remembering what was buried beneath everything you learned to be? There are layers we accept so early that we mistake them for personality, fate, even reality itself. Fear becomes caution. Obedience becomes identity. Shame becomes silence. And eventually, the person underneath all of it can seem almost impossible to recognize. Almost. Because there is one final barrier that can only remain intact while you continue asking the outside world to tell you who you are. And when that seal begins to break, the first thing that returns isn't an answer. It's recognition. Fear rarely enters your life looking like fear. More often, it sounds reasonable. It tells you to wait until you're certain, to avoid embarrassing yourself, to stay where things are predictable, to choose what you already know you can survive. Sometimes it even disguises itself as maturity. You tell yourself you're being realistic, when somewhere beneath that explanation, another part of you knows you're simply trying not to disturb the life you've already built. You may have noticed this most clearly during moments when something inside you wanted to change before your circumstances did. A relationship no longer felt right, but leaving seemed impossible. A familiar career began to feel empty, yet the thought of beginning again created more anxiety than staying unhappy. An old version of your life stopped fitting, but you kept wearing it because you knew its shape. This is one of fear's quietest tricks. It can make a known prison feel safer than an unknown door. And much of this fear may not have begun with you. Long before you were old enough to question the world, you were studying it. You noticed what made adults anxious, what behaviors brought approval, what ambitions were considered unrealistic, what emotions caused tension, what kinds of people were praised and which were criticized. Without consciously deciding to, you learned where the invisible boundaries were. Years later, you may call those boundaries your personality without realizing how many of them were inherited. This is why certain changes can feel disproportionately threatening. You're not simply considering a new decision, you may be approaching a boundary your nervous system learned never to cross. Something as ordinary as speaking more honestly, ending a familiar pattern, moving somewhere new, showing your work, or refusing a role you've always played can produce an almost irrational resistance. The mind interprets unfamiliarity as danger long before it asks whether the unfamiliar thing might actually be necessary. And that resistance can become especially intense just before an old identity begins to loosen. Carl Jung understood that what remains unconscious does not simply disappear. It influences the direction of our lives while appearing to come from somewhere else. Fear works in a similar way. When you don't recognize it, it can masquerade as bad timing, lack of opportunity, intuition, practicality, or even fate. You may look back and notice how often you abandoned something, not because it was wrong for you, but because moving toward it required becoming someone you didn't yet know how to be. The first seal begins to weaken when you see that distinction. Not every warning inside you is wisdom, and not every feeling of safety means you're where you belong. Sometimes the anxiety appearing during a period of change isn't proof that you're moving in the wrong direction. It's evidence that an old protective structure can no longer predict who you're becoming. And once you recognize that fear may have been guarding a boundary rather than revealing a truth, another question begins to surface. If fear didn't decide what you were allowed to become, then who did? At first, obedience is simple. You learn which behaviors are rewarded, which opinions create tension, which dreams sound acceptable, and which parts of you are easier for others to love. No one has to explicitly tell you to abandon yourself. The process is subtler than that. You begin adjusting. You become more agreeable here, quieter there, more practical somewhere else. Eventually, what began as adaptation starts to feel like identity. The strange part is that external authority doesn't need to remain external. After enough repetition, it moves inside you. A parent's caution becomes your hesitation. A teacher's judgment becomes the voice that criticizes your ambition. Cultural expectations become rules you enforce, even when no one is watching. You may be completely alone and still feel as though someone is evaluating your choices. That is when obedience becomes difficult to recognize, because the authority no longer seems separate from you. You may have experienced this whenever you wanted something you couldn't easily justify. Perhaps you felt drawn toward a different path, but immediately began constructing arguments against it. Maybe you wanted to leave a situation, create something, change your lifestyle, or simply stop being available in the same way. Before asking whether the desire was genuine, another question appeared: what will people think? Sometimes that question arrives so quickly that you mistake it for your own judgment. This is why certain people feel strangely unsettled when you begin changing. They may not consciously want to control you. They may simply have become accustomed to the version of you that made their world predictable. When you stop playing a familiar role, the entire relationship has to reorganize. The responsible one becomes unavailable. The quiet one speaks. The accommodating one says no. Suddenly, what feels like growth inside you can look like disruption from the outside. But breaking this seal does not mean rejecting every rule or rebelling against everyone who shaped you. Blind rebellion is still a form of obedience, because your direction is still being determined by what you're resisting. The deeper shift is discernment. You begin asking which values are actually yours, which loyalties still feel alive, and which decisions you would make if approval were removed from the equation. That question can be more unsettling than any rebellion, because it leaves no one else to blame. And once you begin hearing the difference between your own inner recognition and the voices you absorbed from others, something uncomfortable may surface. You may realize that you didn't only silence certain desires to remain acceptable. You may have hidden entire parts of yourself because, at some point, expressing them threatened belonging. That is where the next seal waits, not around what you were told to do, but around what you learned to feel ashamed of. Shame is different from fear because it doesn't merely tell you that something is dangerous. It tells you that something is wrong with you for wanting it, feeling it, or being it. This is how entire parts of a person can disappear from view without ever truly disappearing. A child learns that anger makes people withdraw. Sensitivity invites ridicule. Ambition seems selfish. Desire feels inappropriate, or intuition sounds foolish. So those parts are pushed down, not because they're false, but because belonging once seemed to depend on hiding them. Years later, the hiding becomes so natural that you may not recognize it as hiding anymore. You simply say, "That's not who I am." You become the calm one who never admits resentment, the modest one who distrusts their own ambition, the independent one who refuses to acknowledge how deeply they want connection. Yet what has been rejected continues moving beneath the surface. Jung called this hidden territory the shadow, not because everything inside it is dark, but because it contains whatever consciousness once decided it could not safely include. This is why certain people can provoke unusually strong reactions in you. Someone's confidence irritates you more than it should. Another person's freedom seems irresponsible. Someone who speaks openly about what they want makes you uncomfortable. Sometimes what disturbs you isn't merely something you dislike. It may be something you once learned to forbid in yourself. The intensity of the reaction becomes a clue, because the shadow often announces itself through what we judge before we understand why we're judging it. And there are quieter signs. You may repeatedly sabotage yourself just as something begins going well. You might shrink after receiving attention, minimize your abilities after being praised, or feel strangely guilty when life becomes easier. You may even notice certain dreams returning with images, places, or versions of yourself that feel more alive than your waking identity. These moments can feel confusing because part of you is moving forward while another part is still obeying an old rule. Don't become too visible, too powerful, too different, too much. The third seal weakens when you stop asking whether every hidden part of you deserves immediate approval and begin asking why it had to be hidden in the first place. Facing the shadow doesn't mean acting on every impulse. It means becoming honest enough to see what exists without immediately condemning it. Anger may contain a boundary you never expressed. Envy may point toward a life you secretly want. Grief may reveal what still matters. Even your most uncomfortable reactions can carry information once you stop treating them as evidence against your worth. But this recognition creates another problem. Once you recover something that was buried, you begin to notice how tightly your current identity is organized around keeping the old arrangement intact. The role you play, the relationships you preserve, even the wounds you keep revisiting, may all depend on remaining the person you've already been. And that is when the next seal reveals itself, because sometimes the hardest thing to release isn't pain. It's the identity that learned how to survive through it. You can know that something has ended and still feel unable to release it. A relationship may be over, a dream may have lost its meaning, a role may no longer fit, yet some part of you keeps returning to it. This is because attachment is rarely about the thing itself. More often, it is about the identity that existed around it. To let go can feel less like losing a person, a place, or a plan, and more like losing the version of yourself that knew how to exist there. That is why people sometimes remain loyal to forms of suffering they consciously want to escape. The mind prefers continuity, even painful continuity, because what is familiar can be predicted. You may complain about the same relationship pattern, revisit the same wound, or keep imagining the same future even after it has stopped feeling alive. Not because you secretly want to suffer, but because the old pain has become part of the map you use to recognize yourself. Without it, there is suddenly empty space. This becomes especially visible during periods of profound inner change. Old friendships may begin to feel strangely distant. Goals you chased for years can suddenly seem hollow. Places that once felt like home may feel too small without anything objectively being wrong with them. You might wonder whether you're becoming ungrateful or unstable. But sometimes what you are feeling is not rejection. It is the disorientation that comes when consciousness has moved beyond a structure your identity is still trying to preserve. The deeper form of attachment is not, "I need this." It is, "I know who I am because of this." I am the one who was betrayed. I am the one who always rescues everyone. I am the overlooked one, the strong one, the misunderstood one, the responsible one. Even painful identities can provide a strange sense of coherence. And once an identity becomes familiar enough, anything that threatens it can feel dangerous, including healing itself. This is why transformation sometimes produces grief, even when you are moving towards something better. Something really is dying, but it may not be your essence. It may be the arrangement through which you learned to interpret your entire life. The fourth seal begins to crack when you realize that letting go does not erase what happened to you. It simply stops requiring the past to keep repeating itself so that you can continue knowing who you are. And then a stranger question appears. If you can become attached to an identity, what else have you mistaken for reality simply because you have repeated it long enough? What if certain conclusions about your life have hardened into facts only because you stopped questioning them? Once attachment loosens, the world does not necessarily change at once. But the way you see it begins to shift, and that is where the fifth seal has been waiting. There are beliefs you question, and then there are beliefs you no longer recognize as beliefs at all. They feel like facts. You're unlucky. You always choose the wrong people. You're too late. You're not the kind of person who gets certain opportunities. Life is harder for you than it seems to be for others. These conclusions may have begun as interpretations of real experiences, but repetition can harden interpretation into reality until you stop noticing the difference between what happened and what you decided it meant. This is one reason recurring patterns can feel so mysterious. Different year, different person, different place, yet somehow the emotional ending feels familiar. You may wonder why the same disappointment keeps returning in different clothing. Part of the answer is uncomfortable. Perception does not passively receive reality. It organizes attention. When you expect rejection, You notice certain signals more quickly. When you believe you must struggle to deserve anything, ease can feel suspicious. The old story quietly filters what becomes visible. This doesn't mean you imagined everything that happened to you, nor does it mean reality bends obediently to thought. It means that experience and interpretation become intertwined so tightly that one can begin reinforcing the other. A person who believes they are unwanted may tolerate relationships that confirm it. Someone convinced they are powerless may overlook small moments where choice is still possible. The illusion is not that the world is unreal. The illusion is believing your inherited interpretation of the world is the world itself. Ancient mystical traditions often described awakening through images of veils, mirrors, dreams, and hidden appearances. Read psychologically, these symbols point toward something surprisingly intimate. The veil may be the story through which you have been seeing everything. This is why a single realization can sometimes rearrange years of memory. Nothing in the past changes, yet suddenly you understand an old relationship differently, forgive a decision you once hated yourself for, or recognize that what you called failure redirected your entire life. You may have experienced moments like this already. A coincidence suddenly connects two events you never associated before. A conversation makes an old pattern obvious. A dream lingers because it seems to contain an emotion you haven't admitted while awake. Or an ordinary moment produces the strange sensation that you're seeing your own life from outside the story you normally tell about it. For a second, the structure becomes visible. And once you've seen the structure, it becomes much harder to mistake it for the whole of reality. But seeing through one illusion creates a more dangerous possibility. The moment you realize that most people are living inside stories they cannot see, the ego can quietly construct a new story. That you are one of the few who have awakened. That you understand what others don't. That hidden knowledge has somehow placed you above them. And this illusion is harder to detect than the others because it can wear the language of truth while protecting the very identity you thought you were leaving behind. There is a subtle moment in almost every awakening when discovery becomes identity. You begin seeing patterns you once missed. Certain conversations feel shallow. Old ambitions lose their grip. You become more interested in consciousness, symbolism, synchronicity, or the hidden motives beneath human behavior. At first, this can feel liberating, but somewhere along the way, a dangerous thought can quietly enter. Perhaps you see what others cannot because you are somehow more awake than they are. This is the sixth seal, and it is difficult to recognize because it rarely feels like arrogance. It may feel like certainty. You become convinced that every coincidence confirms your interpretation. Every intuitive feeling carries special significance. Every disagreement proves someone else simply hasn't reached your level of awareness. The ego has an extraordinary ability to survive transformation by changing costumes. It can abandon one identity while immediately building another, more sophisticated one around being spiritual, perceptive, chosen, or unusually conscious. You may notice this in the way you begin reacting to people who still value the things you've outgrown. Their concerns seem trivial. Their routines feel unconscious. Their decisions become easy to judge. Perhaps you stop explaining yourself because you assume they wouldn't understand. Yet something strange happens when this attitude takes hold. The very awakening that once made reality feel wider begins making your world smaller again. Curiosity disappears. Certainty replaces it, and other people become characters in a story designed to confirm who you believe yourself to be. Jung warned, in different language, about the danger of identifying with powerful inner experiences. Contact with something psychologically profound can inflate the personality rather than transform it. The person touches mystery and begins believing the mystery belongs to them. But genuine insight usually has the opposite effect. The more carefully you observe your own mind, the harder it becomes to pretend you are free from projection, contradiction, fear, or self-deception. What you understand expands, but so does your awareness of everything you may still be misunderstanding. This is why the sixth seal begins breaking through humility rather than knowledge. Not the humility of making yourself small, but the humility of remaining uncertain enough to keep seeing. You stop needing every synchronicity to prove something about your destiny. You allow intuition to speak without turning it into unquestionable authority. You become less interested in being one of the few who know, and more interested in discovering where your own perception may still be distorted. The mystery becomes deeper precisely because you no longer need to possess it. And then something unexpected happens. When you stop needing awakening to make you special, there is almost nothing left between you and the final seal. No superior identity to protect, no hidden title to claim, no external teacher who can certify what you are becoming. You are left with a quieter question, one that may have been waiting beneath every fear, every rule, every wound, every attachment, and every illusion. Who were you before you learned to ask permission to be yourself? The final seal does not break with a dramatic revelation. There may be no vision, no sudden certainty, no external sign confirming that you have finally arrived somewhere. In fact, it can feel almost disappointingly quiet. You simply begin noticing that you no longer need the same permission you once searched for everywhere. The need to be understood weakens. The need to justify what you feel becomes less urgent. Something inside you has stopped waiting for the world to explain you back to yourself. This remembering is not about recovering some forgotten supernatural identity or discovering who you were in another lifetime. It is closer than that. You begin remembering qualities that existed before they were negotiated away. Your ability to sense when something felt wrong, your curiosity before it was redirected, your intensity before it was called excessive, your imagination before practicality narrowed it. What returns is not a biography. It is a way of recognizing yourself that existed before fear and approval became your primary reference points. You may already have experienced brief moments of it. Perhaps you made a decision recently that surprised even you because, for once, you did not ask everyone what they thought. Maybe you walked away from something you would once have tolerated. Maybe a strange calm appeared in a situation that normally would have triggered you. Nothing spectacular happened, yet afterward you felt different. These moments can seem small from the outside, but internally they reveal something enormous. Authority is beginning to move back home. And this changes the meaning of many experiences that brought you here. The relationship that ended may not have been proof that you were abandoned. The period of confusion may not have meant you were lost. The strange coincidences, recurring dreams, sudden aversion to old goals, and persistent sense that your life was changing may not need one grand explanation. Their significance may lie in what they forced you to notice. Again and again, life may have been removing the places where you had outsourced your own knowing. The paradox is that remembering yourself does not make you more certain about everything. It often makes you more comfortable with uncertainty. You no longer need every intuition to become prophecy, or every coincidence to become a message. You can let mystery remain mystery without feeling threatened by it. What grows stronger is something more grounded, your capacity to recognize what is true for you without immediately demanding proof from someone else. This is not absolute certainty, it is inner authorship. And perhaps this is why the final seal could never have been opened for you by a teacher, a relationship, a book, or even this video. Anything outside you could only bring you close enough to notice what had been waiting underneath the noise. The final threshold appears when you realize that the person you have been trying to become may be less important than the person you no longer need to abandon. And once that recognition happens, another question remains. What does your life become when you finally stop asking permission to live from it? Maybe the final seal was never something you had to force open. Maybe it began breaking the moment you stopped treating fear as truth, obedience as identity, shame as proof, attachment as love, illusion as reality, and knowledge as superiority. What remains underneath all of that is quieter than the person you were taught to become, but also far more difficult to betray once you recognize it. You may still feel uncertain, you may still have questions, but perhaps you no longer need every answer before trusting what is becoming clear inside you. Pay attention to what no longer fits, to what keeps returning, and to the moments when you feel strangely more like yourself than before. If this message reached you at the right moment, subscribe and stay close to what we explore here, and like the video so others who may be standing at the same threshold can find it too. And if you feel that something in you has already remembered, leave one word in the comments. Remember,